project governance and digital transformation, Trump's oversight of artificial intelligence, and how to decide whether or not ERP consultants are really worth the money. That's what we're going to talk about, among other things, in episode 206 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 206. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is the podcast that has everything to do with digital strategy, including the people, process, technology aspects of change. And my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And I'm excited for today's episode. We've got some really cool stuff we're going to talk about here today. We're going to, first of all, start off with some questions from social media that we've received over the last couple of weeks. And then we're going to get into some newsworthy topics, in particular, why companies are selling off assets to fund artificial intelligence, and also the news that Trump is repealing, or U.S. President Trump is repealing Biden's AI oversight order. And then we'll have our first guest on the show, Nate Stroeher, who's going to be on to talk about project governance and controls and digital transformation. And then finally, in the third segment, we'll get to whether or not ERP consultants are really worth the money and how you can determine whether or not you've got the right ERP consultants helping you. So those are just a few of the things we'll cover here in today's episode. But before we jump into our first guest, Darian, what are some of the questions we've received on social media here recently?
Yeah, some good questions. The first one today is, what's the difference between selecting a software vendor versus a software consultant? Who does what, and what are the roles and expectations for each?
Great question. There's a couple different ways to look at this. So, I mean, first of all, you almost want to look at those decisions separately because they are sort of two different answers. You have the product or the software itself that you're trying to select for your organization, and then you've got to figure out which is the right consultant to help you implement. So let's start with the product. When you're deciding the product, you don't necessarily need to base, or you shouldn't necessarily base the decision of the product based on whatever consultant you're working with. In fact, I would argue that if anything, that would create more bias or introduce more bias into the evaluation process if you do that through an ERP consultant. Of course, if you're working with a software vendor, they're going to focus solely on selling you their software. So it's somewhat expected that they would be biased. But you at least you could take that with a grain of salt, choose the product that fits you best, and then find the right consultant that can help you through the process. Now, as it relates to consultants, there's a couple different ways to look at it. One is you could, in many cases, depending on the vendor, you could hire consultants directly from the software vendor. A lot of them, or most of them, have professional services groups that can provide technical implementation services. And or you could go look at third-party providers that are third-party specialists that focus on that one software. Now, the tricky part, though, is sometimes I'll pick on Microsoft for a minute. Microsoft Dynamics, for example. In most cases, when you buy Microsoft Dynamics, you have to go through a system integrator or evaluated reseller. So you have to go through a third-party consulting firm that is affiliated with Microsoft, because Microsoft doesn't do as much sales directly themselves. So a lot of it does depend on which software you're looking at. But the third thing I'll kind of throw into the mix, and something for consideration, is that's why clients hire us. They'll hire us at Third Stage Consulting because we're independent, we're tech agnostic, we're not affiliated with any of the software vendors, and we can help clients navigate both the product decision and the decision of which technical implementing consultants you need or want. And by the way, typically you're going to need more than just technical consultants to help you be successful in your project. You'll also need help with PMO and change management, process improvement, things of that nature that technical consultants generally don't do, or they don't do well. So those are a few of the considerations. You've got the vendor / product. You've got the technical consultants, which may or may not be part of the vendor or a third party. And then you've got the third thing is the independent tech agnostic consulting firm like Third Stage that can help you through not only the decision process, but also the planning of the implementation and execution of the implementation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great overview of the difference between, software vendors, software consultants, and then independent consultants. But I want to get to our next question today, and it's what and how do you envision the explosion of AI, quantum computing, and blockchain role in digital transformation space?
What's the first part of it? What do I make of it?
Yeah, like what and how do you envision the explosion of it? Of all three of those things, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like AI is sort of permeating every technology that's out there, every sort of enterprise tech and even consumer tech that's out there. So, I mean, I don't know of a software vendor that's not investing heavily in AI right now, or at least saying they're investing heavily in AI. I think they're still working on how to embed AI within their offerings and their solutions. I think the big guys like SAP and Oracle, and maybe even Microsoft, actually probably Microsoft even more so, just because of the Copilot investment they have and the involvement they have with OpenAI and ChatGPT. But you look at those big software vendors, and they're on the forefront of AI, and they're sort of baking that into their capabilities or in their functionality. Then the tier 2, tier 3, the smaller mid-market sort of vendors are doing the same thing. So I think it's probably something that, in 3 or 5 years from now, we may not be talking about AI as much. Sort of like, I think at some point we'll stop talking about cloud computing, because it's sort of like, it is what it is. I mean, every system out there is in the cloud. So are you going to make a big deal about the fact that we're talking about cloud? We're only talking about it now because companies are still making that transition from on-prem to cloud. And in the case of AI, we're still making that transition from, old school analytics and reporting and BI to AI. But at some point, as AI becomes embedded in all these different technologies, it probably becomes, the AI itself is obviously still important, but we're not talking about it as much. We're not observing trends or, things that affect the software in the way, because it's so well baked into it. So that's where I see it going, is I think it's just going to be such a core part of any enterprise technology or any technology in general that it almost becomes a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll become something that everybody is using in their daily life. It seems like whether in the tech space or not, it's going to be something that most people are going to be utilizing or using in some way. So maybe something that will become more natural and less talked about, like you're saying.
Yeah. It's generations from now, they may not even know what AI is, just because it's such a basic, fundamental part of life.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, wait, you had life before AI? How did that happen?
They may not even understand what it means not to have AI. That's probably
exactly. Exactly. Well, great. We're going to get into our 2 articles of the day. These topics are really interesting. This first one has to do with AI. Well, actually, they both do, but this one particularly has to do with why companies are selling off assets to fund AI. So like you talked about, a lot of different softwares are investing in AI or saying they're investing in AI, but this is kind of happening around across the board. So companies are finding ways or creative ways to fund expensive AI projects, with some selling off non-core assets. Big names like OpenText have divested parts of their business to focus on AI innovation, aligning with the trend reported by EY, where 59% of IT CEOs plan to divestments in 2025. I feel like we've talked about this quite a bit with just in the tech industry, but with AI spending skyrocketing to 98% of the Fortune 1000 leaders, and it's planned to increase this year. Not everyone agrees that AI is a main driver, and some see the divestments as a way to streamline operations or reduce technical debt. The challenge with this, though, we've also mentioned this before, is many AI projects still lack clear revenue returns, making these investments high stakes or kind of a gamble for ROI in the future. With this, Eric, when we see companies selling off non-core assets to fund AI projects, do you see this as a sustainable trend, or is this a short-term solution to an expensive problem?
It's a good question. I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective before, but I'd say, I don't know. I'd be a little skeptical of how long that really continues. I mean, I'm surprised. I didn't know that this was a trend that we're starting to see in the space. So I'm kind of learning along with the audience here at the same time. But I don't know. I guess it comes back to if we really back up for a second and we think about just tech spending in general for a non-tech company like a manufacturing company or a healthcare organization, whatever it is. You have to look at, what are your priorities? What do you think is going to give you the best ROI on your investments, whether it's new technology like AI or some other non-AI based technology. Although, like we discussed a minute ago, it's going to be hard to invest in any sort of technology without also investing in AI. Even if you wanted to try not to invest in AI, you're probably getting it, whether you like it or not. So you have to think of it from that perspective, but also it's sort of like a big manufacturing company. A lot of times they might have to choose between, do I open that new factory, that assembly line, or invest in that new distribution center, or open that new factory, or do I invest in a $50 million ERP project or whatever it is? So it's sort of like that. I mean, you kind of have to. I mean, assuming that most companies are going to continue to have finite resources and finite budgets, they're going to have to decide and make those trade-offs. So that's one thing. And the other thing you've got to look at too is how risk adverse and how aggressive you want to be as a company. If you're super risk adverse and you're say you're a third generation family business and you're growing at you've been very successful, you're growing at a 5% annual rate, nothing crazy, it's not bad, but nothing super aggressive. It may not make sense, especially if you're a conservative organization and you're sort of just trying to keep somewhat of the status quo, or you're just trying to make incremental improvements. It may not make sense yet to make a big gamble on AI. But if you're a more of an aggressive company, or you're growing really fast, or you think that AI could help you fuel really fast growth, and that's one of your stated objectives, and you have more tolerance for risk, then sure, it might make sense to invest more in AI. But you still have to prioritize between investing in technology like AI or making other capital in OpEx investments that you might want to make. So I don't know that the technology itself really changes the fact that you've got to prioritize and do what's most aligned with and supportive of your business and your culture and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, definitely. That is a great point. And it leads to my next question of, could focusing heavily on an AI investment lead to neglect in other areas of a business, such as customer experience or operational stability?
Not if AI enables some of those things. So, if you, for example, customer experience, if you provide more of a, what's it called, the agentic AI, or basically providing a customer service chatbot sort of intelligence that allows customers to ask questions and get immediate responses without having to go poke around on your website or go look up their order, on a e-commerce site or whatever, that can actually help enable the customer experience. So it gets back to the point of, as long as you have a deliberate focus of what you want AI to do, then you can actually kill two birds with the same stone. But I would just warn companies not to invest in AI just because they think they should, or because everyone else is, without first understanding what is it we want to tackle first, and what priority do we feel like, or what area of the business do we feel like AI could have the biggest positive impact and biggest positive ROI. So
within the IT sector specifically, and how they are leading the way currently in investments in AI and funding AI, is there particular challenges or opportunities in this sector, specifically the IT one, that make this strategy more viable compared to other sectors?
Well, I think part of it is because, certainly if you're a software vendor, you deliver software to your customers, you almost have to have AI as not a foregone conclusion, but as a focus or as a priority in your R&D and your innovation of the technical product. But even if you're not a software vendor per se, but you're still a technical or a IT based company, chances are higher that you're a more aggressive and more of a high growth and more of a risk tolerant sort of organization, which would make more sense for a company like that to invest in IT compared to a 150-year-old manufacturing company that's been around forever and has just had slow incremental growth over the years or whatever. So I think that both culturally and strategically, and certainly based on the fact that they're in the technical space, I think that's sort of what fuels a lot of that investment in AI for those those IT focused organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think there are other industries that this trend will extend to where we'll see that industry specifically investing in AI more aggressively next, besides the tech driven companies?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind as sort of a knee jerk reaction. One is the larger companies, the companies that have more resources at their disposal to invest in AI, and also not only the money they have, but also the assets they have in terms of current systems and data. That makes them more ripe candidates for investments in AI. But in addition to company size, another consideration is I think high complexity sorts of organizations are more likely to invest in AI. So, for example, the first thing that comes to mind is like a supply chain intensive organization that has to manage a lot in terms of procurement and distribution centers and logistics and transportation and quality, vendor management, all that stuff. I think those organizations that are more complex and have global supply chains, that to me is sort of the ideal low hanging fruit for AI to help clean up or enable some of the system limitations or data limitations they might have right now with their current systems. And certainly when you've got complexity, I mean, that plays to AI's strengths, because part of the problem with global organizations and global supply chains is you rely on humans to manage all these moving parts, and it's very complex, it's very difficult to do. So if you can use AI to help streamline some of that and bring some of that together more effectively, I think that's another area where I see that probably trending towards AI faster.
Yeah, definitely. So recently, Trump just took office, and he signed some different executive orders and repeals. And one of them, Trump was on his first day, repealed Joe Biden's 2023 executive order that mandated stricter oversight of AI development, prioritizing innovation over regulation. The Biden era order required safety evaluations for high risk AI systems and aimed to address threats like cybersecurity and national security risks. Critics, however, argued that it stifled technology advancements. Trump's repeal shifts focus back to innovation, with supporters praising the reduced regulatory constraints. However, experts warned the lack of oversight could lead to fragmented AI governance, uneven implementation, and risks to public safety. The move reflects a broader bipartisan divide between Republicans framing deregulation as essential for free speech and human flourishing. With this, Eric, this debate obviously highlights a key question: how do we balance AI innovation with safeguarding societal and national interests?
Yeah, sort of related, but unrelated at the same time. It sort of gets back to the TikTok ban in the U.S. that lasted a few hours before Trump lifted it. But it's the same kind of thing. That was a national security concern, and then ultimately Trump said, let's give it some extra time to sort out the national security issues that are legitimate. I think both sides of the political spectrum in the U.S. agree that it needs to be addressed. It's just a matter of how you address it. And I think the same is probably true for AI, although AI is still so nascent. It's still emerging in many ways in terms of how it's actually going to evolve. And I think if you stifle it too soon, or you jump in too soon with regulations or make it more difficult, it not only scares away investors, it scares away entrepreneurs, it scares away innovation. And also, I think, if you're the government, any government, whether it's U.S. government or any government throughout the world, the tendency or the bias is going to be towards safety and regulation and slowing things down. And I know there's a school of thought that even Elon Musk was a part of a couple of years ago. He was on board with kind of slowing down AI advancement just to give it time to see how things are gonna evolve and how it's gonna affect job security and whatnot. So I think unfortunately, I think it's in order to get the best of both worlds, where you allow innovation, but you also protect the negative impact potentially from that innovation. I think you have to let some of the world, and you have to feel some of the pain, I guess would be the way to put it. I mean, you have to start to see signs that, okay, people are starting to lose their jobs because of AI. Let's just say that's what the government's worried about. Or we have some data IP issues now that just are getting out of hand, or we could see it getting out of hand. I think there might be early warning signs of that, but I don't know that we're quite there yet to where any government needs to step in and say, okay, we're gonna take over here and regulate this and put some guardrails in place. I think they'll have to eventually. It's just a matter of when. So I think, my bias, if I have one, is towards letting tech companies innovate, and if you see that things are starting to slide off the rails, at that point you put in the guardrails. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
For sure. And with, companies wanting to use AI within their company, how can they, in this deregulated environment, how can they self-regulate to ensure responsible AI practices within their company?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it becomes part of your standard operating procedures and your employee handbook and things like that. I think you have to look at intellectual property and data and look at what's happening to that information. I think that's back to your previous question. I'll come back to this one too, but it just triggered a follow up to what I was saying before. Is if you could put that would be an example of like intellectual property and data security. That's something that I think would be a little bit more targeted for the government to go pursue and say, okay, we need to put guardrails in place for how data and IP is treated within these big open AI models in particular. I think ultimately the government's not going to be able to fix that. I think ultimately it's going to have to work itself through the courts. And I think that's the only way that any of this stuff gets resolved. And that's going to take, I think this will go on for decades. I don't think that'll get solved anytime soon. So I think information and data is probably going to become a lot more commoditized, even more so than it already is as a result of AI. Anyway, back to your question of, sorry, what was your follow-up question? I already forgot what it was.
That's okay. It was, for companies that are using AI and want to use it within their business still in this deregulated environment, how can businesses self-regulate to ensure that they're using AI responsibly, basically?
First of all, you still have like data privacy laws, like in the EU and whatnot, where you have to adhere to that stuff. So as it relates to data privacy, you have some regulations in place already in certain parts of the world that govern that. But I think, businesses just need to be aware of the potential downside risk of AI and put policies and procedures in place and training. You've got to train people. You've got to make sure they understand what happens to data and sensitive information when you plug it into an open AI model or whatever the case may be. So I think that's a big part of it. And then also know, like when you go with your software vendors, or when you purchase a new software and there's AI built into that software, like for example, SAP S/4HANA. What S/4HANA has done is they've actually asked their customers to give permission to be part of a learned AI model. So in other words, if you buy SAP S/4HANA in the cloud, it's not a foregone conclusion that you're automatically going to feed that data into an AI model that then can learn and teach that AI model, but you can opt into it. So I don't think that's a law yet, but that's something that SAP has done to sort of regulate themselves and regulate how their customers use AI. And that's something you should dig into with your software vendors is, what happens to the data? What options do we have with whether or not we want to be part of a larger AI model? So that's the kind of stuff you've got to think about, because AI craves data, and the more data you can feed it, the more it learns, the smarter it gets, the more effective it gets. But if there's risk or there's problems or fears about that data getting misappropriated or sensitive information getting out as a result of that AI model, or you losing control of that data, then perhaps it's not worth the upside. So you kind of have to look at, how risk adverse you are, how much you want to lock things down versus open yourself up to potential innovation with some of these AI models.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some great topics today and good questions from the audience, but I'm excited to get into this interview today.
Yeah, we'll talk about, speaking of guardrails, guardrails for digital transformations. We're going to talk about how to master project governance, controls, methodologies, and how do you put that structure in place, the guardrails and the controls to make sure that your digital transformation is successful, whether you're implementing AI or ERP or any sort of enterprise technology. So we're going to bring on Nate Stroeher from Third Stage Consulting onto the show to chat about that. And interestingly, Nate is responsible for the project governance here at Third Stage. So he works across all of our clients to ensure that we've got the right governance controls in place for the projects we deliver our clients. So he's a perfect person to have talk about that. So we're going to bring Nate on in the show here in just a second to talk about that. And then later in the show, after Nate joins us, we're going to talk a little bit at the end of the episode about whether or not ERP consultants are worth the money and how you can determine whether or not the ones you're looking at or considering are the right ones. So we're going to talk about that later in the show. So stick around. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 206. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also see past episodes of the show at transformationgroundcontrol.com. We put out new episodes every Wednesday. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and produced by Major Tom Productions. So thank you for being here today. And speaking of Third Stage Consulting, which is the company that Darian and I are affiliated with, we're going to bring on a third person here on the show that's affiliated with Third Stage Consulting. And his name is Nate Stroeher. He's been on the podcast before, but it's been a while, so it's excited to have him back again. This is the first time he's been on talking about this topic, which isn't always the most glamorous topic to talk about, but it's really important. It's something that will keep your project on track and allow you, the implementing organization, to take control and ownership of your project without having to outsource necessarily or just throw things over the curtain to a software vendor and hope that they deliver on time, on budget, and delivering the value you want. So project governance and controls is a great way to help you internally within an organization take ownership and control of the project, and as well as the fact that it helps you, hold each other accountable and identify risks and make sure that you fix risks before they become a big, problematic, and expensive proposition. So all that being said, excited to have this conversation here with Nate Stroeher from Third Stage Consulting. Nate, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Eric. Excited to talk about this today.
Yeah, it's been a while since you've been on the podcast, so it's great to have you back. And I don't think we've covered this exact topic before, so it'll be great to chat with you about some of your client experiences. But before we jump into that, the client experience and sort of this whole concept of project controls and governance, tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Third Stage.
So I'm the practice lead at Third Stage, and my role is to make sure that we are doing the best job we can to make our product that we present to the client as uniform and as quality and as standard as possible. To make sure that we're giving the client exactly what we've promised we would deliver them from the first time we spoke to them all the way through to the final deliverable that we present to them. So as my role at practice lead, I'm in charge of putting together the tools that our teams use and the methodologies that our teams follow throughout these projects to ensure that we're giving you the best quality product that we can throughout the life cycle of the project.
Gotcha. And how about your background leading up to your role here at Third Stage? You've got a pretty interesting background leading up to this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've been in consulting for just about a little over 25 years. Started with Deloitte Consulting out of grad school. Have a background in digital transformation and change management, and also a lot of work around the finance transformation field. So really have focused a lot on both the technology side of it and the change management side of it. Obviously, working for a Big Four consulting firm at the beginning of my career was exposed and became very comfortable with very set methodologies, very set ways of doing things. So where my experience has been valuable and where I can add a lot to Third Stage Consulting and to our engagements is that mindset of trying to make everything that we do as uniform as possible and to give our employees and our partners the best tools that they can use to present to the clients and to really give the clients the best product that we can.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. It's an important and underrated role, in my opinion. So that's why it's fun to chat about this with you here today. But for those that may not know, maybe there's some people listening right now that are not project manager types. Maybe they're not PMP certified, or maybe they don't have sort of your traditional project management training or background. Help us understand, just when we talk about the word project governance, what does that mean and why is it so important to keeping a digital transformation on track?
Well, really, and I kind of break project governance down into about 6 to 7 different areas, but it's really at a very high level. It's putting the guidelines and the controls and the methodology and the framework in place that allows a project, or I'm going to use project and a program interchangeably here, but it allows a project to stay on course. And the best way I can describe it, I was trying to think of it last night, is if you think about driving down a highway, you have your guardrails on the side of the road to keep everyone from going off the road and hurting themselves in an accident. The guardrails are really more the controls that project governance put in place. Then you have your lane markers that really kind of allow everyone to know what their roles are and where they play, that what their role plays in the specific project. And then you have your highway signs that are really more the communication side. So it's really it's putting the proper tools in place, and it's putting the structure in place that puts the proper rules, regulations, and controls in place, mitigates the risk as much as possible, clearly defines the roles and responsibilities. And then really the most important is the communication and the documentation throughout the project. How are we going to let all the team members know what's going on, and making that communication consistent and clear and concise throughout the project?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I never heard that. I've heard the guardrail analogy, but never the full highway analogy. With not only the guardrails, but the line markers and the signs and everything. That's a great analogy. And then occasionally you see, like, you're driving down the highway, and you see the skid mark of a car that like ran into the guardrail. The guardrail's all mangled, but you could see that it's still intact. So it kind of reminds you of, like, even human behavior and mistakes and things like that might lead a transformation down off the highway. But if you got that guardrail in place, it might still be a slight accident, but it's a lot less tragic than if you hadn't had the guardrails there. So that's a good analogy there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, good. So I want to say hi to the audience here. A couple people have chimed in on where they're joining from today. Someone on LinkedIn joining from Glasgow, UK, although I can't see the name, so I apologize for that. Alcinda joining from Johannesburg, South Africa. Darian joining from Denver. Thanks for joining. And then Edmund on LinkedIn. Didn't say where he's from, but he says hello. So hello to you, Edmund. Thanks for being here today. And again, thank you to everyone for joining here today. If you have questions for Nate, we're talking about mastering project governance in digital transformations and ERP implementation. So I'm curious to hear from the audience. As I'm asking Nate this next question, I'm curious to hear from the audience though. If you feel like your project or projects you've been involved with in the past, if you feel like if you've used project governance or if you've had a good experience or any sort of experience with project governance, I'd love to hear any comments you have around that in the chat here. And we're keeping an eye on that as we go through the questions here. So just diving into that a little bit. So that was a great analogy you just described around the highway, analogy for digital transformation project governance. But what are some of the key elements that you would look for in a strong project governance framework?
Well, I'll jump in on, and I might be repeating myself a little bit from what I just said, but I think it's really, and I'll kind of narrow it down to about 7 different areas, but it's really getting the rules and the regulations and the controls in place, and basically trying to figure out is the project set up for success, and do we have the right rules in place and the right controls in place so that when we get through with this project and as we're implementing the technology or implementing the change management initiative, are we doing it so that we're not only going to support the organization, but that we're not going to that we're also going to support the organization's adherence to these rules and regulations. And I bring that up and in the sense that we have a lot of clients that have ISO compliance issues or compliance requirements, that we have dealing with finance. We have a lot of SEC requirements. So it's really making sure that not only is the project going to adhere to these rules and regulations, but that it supports the overall organization's adherence. And then we talk about risk management and mitigation. Again, kind of making sure that we are doing the best that we can to mitigate our risk. You're never going to eliminate risk, but when we go back to the guardrail analogy, do we have a guardrail in place so that if something does go off the rails, we're going to be able to limit the amount of damage that's done going forward? Then we really get into kind of the heart of the tools that we're putting in place. And that is at the onset of the project, sitting down and really clearly laying out what the roles and responsibilities are. Who's responsible for what is their role in the engagement, everywhere from the executive leadership team all the way down to the day-to-day people that are going to be working on this project as part of their job, or really maybe as a full-time job, what exactly those roles are and how they interact with everyone. Then we talk about where does that play in the overall project plan. So do we have the clearly defined roles, responsibilities, milestones, and deliverables? So do we know who's doing what, when it's going to be done, and who's responsible for getting that done? Then I really think that probably the most important is communication and documentation. And this is really critical. And I think if we look at probably one of the biggest success factors and one of the biggest causes of failure in a project and in an overall in client engagement, it's the lack of controls and the lack of documentation. So it's really sitting down and saying, how are we going to communicate? And when we talk about the communication, we talk about how it has to be the proper communication at the proper time, and adhering to the proper levels. So when we talk about, we work a lot with manufacturing clients. The communication to the manufacturing floor is likely going to be different than the communication to the executive team. The executive team could be traveling. They could, they're going to have about an hour every 2 to 3 weeks to hear these communications and be involved in these status calls. Whereas with the people that are working on the technology on a day-to-day basis are going to need to hear it more constantly. That also is going to change throughout the project. As a project kicks off, we're going to need a lot more communication. As we're going through the day-to-day operations, there's probably going to be a lull where the communication is going to be a lot more 2 to 3 bullet points on here's where we are, here's where we're going. And then towards the end, as we get towards go live, again, that communication is going to ramp up. So it's the proper communication to the proper levels at the proper time.
Yeah, well said. Now, what about just playing devil's advocate for a minute? Is it safe to assume that if I hire a software vendor, or when I hire my software vendor for an ERP implementation, whatever technology I'm deploying, hire the software vendor, they're giving me a project manager. So, and they've got a methodology, each software vendor has their own methodologies that they use, that kind of a branded methodology. What can I just rely on that to serve the function that you're talking about here, serve the purpose that you're talking about with project governance?
Well, I say probably yes and no. There's a real on the fence answer, but I think we do deal. You're exactly right. Everyone's got their different methodologies, their different ways of doing things. I think the real critical point of success is sitting down and making sure those elements are followed. So if they have a really complex project plan, does everyone understand it, and can everyone use that, and can everyone use that as a framework going forward? If it's so complex that only the vendor understands it and the rest of the team doesn't, then we need to adjust that, and we need to put new formats in place that are going to allow everyone to know where we're going, who's doing what, and when we're doing it. Communications is another really important subject. I think it's clear, and on our third stage engagements, we try and come up with a very simple but very detailed communication plan, status report every week, letting everyone know what we've done, what's coming up, who's responsible for it, potential roadblocks, potential challenges going forward, and how this fits into the overall plan. We also track the issues, what issues are outstanding, what issues have been decided, and what decisions have been made. So we, again, I think any tool is probably okay as long as it's fits the situation. If it doesn't, we have to adjust it so that it's useful for not only the vendor, but for the entire team who will be using it throughout the engagement.
Yeah. It's well said. And then, usually, one thing I found is that, typically the vendor has, kind of a technical project manager typically. I mean, they're the ones that know the software. They know how to guide decisions around the design, build, and testing of the technology. But that's just one work stream within an overall program. And so what you're talking about is really sort of like, if we want to be technically accurate here, we would call this program governance and program controls, because you're kind of looking across not just the software vendor work stream, but you're looking across change management, process improvement, and the architecture integration. And if you've got multiple software solutions you're implementing, that makes program governance even more important. So I think that's one way to look at it too. In fact, as we're talking here, I'm just going to drop it in the screen here. Sorry, bear with me. I'm terrible at multitasking. So I'm going to put up a QR code that talks about the difference between gosh, sorry to amuse everyone. I hope this is as amusing as it is to me, but trying to multitask is not my strong suit here.
Give everyone a chance to get a sip of coffee here.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to pop it up here on the screen, up on the top of your screen here. If you just scan the QR code, and we'll drop it in the chat for those that are listening to the audio only version of the podcast. But there's a YouTube video I did. It's a whiteboard video where I describe the difference between project management and program management. I don't talk a lot about project governance and controls in it. I sort of mention it in passing, but it does unpack the difference between project management and then the overall program management. I think really we're talking at more of the program level. All the stuff you're talking about is how do you preserve that or get those controls in place for across all the different work streams in a digital transformation. So check out this video when you get a chance. You can bookmark it or whatever. It's like a 20-minute whiteboard video where I unpack it a little bit more detail. But you can scan the QR code if you want to watch that video after our conversation here. So that's a good overview of sort of, what program management is, what the different components are, why your software vendor isn't necessarily the cure or the silver bullet to give you the program governance. Because a lot of times, when you're working with these software vendors, their heads down, focused on their piece of the puzzle, right? And that's their job. You brought them in to help design, build, and test technology, but that's just one piece of many that goes into this. And so that's where the guardrails come into place. So speaking of methodologies, what are some of the tools, regardless of whether you're talking about, like, for example, SAP has their, I I forgot what it's called now. It used to be called the ASAP methodology, but they changed it. And I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called now. Microsoft has Sure Step. They all have these different branded methodologies and tool sets and whatnot that all kind of look the same. I mean, they're slightly different flavors, but they cover the basics of deploying technology. Doesn't address the non-technical stuff, but it at least addresses the technology side. But what are some of the methodologies you recommend in general, aside from what the software vendor might bring to the table? What are some of the general methodologies that you recommend for ensuring project controls are effective throughout an implementation?
I think, and this will be a little bit of an on the fence answer, so I apologize in advance, but I think, there's thousands, you mentioned it, there's thousands of methodologies. In fact, I did a search the other day, and I think you can find probably upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 different methodologies. And even if you go to the big four, they all talk about their methodologies and how they're so unique and so different. I think really no matter what you choose, you just need to have the basics in place. And, and I'll go back to, again, the points that we're going to keep making throughout this time that we're together, but it's really making sure that you have the clearly defined roles, clearly defined tasks, milestones, deliverables, reporting structure, communication channels, and really, again, using the right complexity for the organization. So if you're coming into an organization, or if you're an organization that's on this podcast and you have you have 40 employees, so you're a smaller, maybe less than 100 million in business, your methodology is, you don't want to go put in place a methodology that's going to be more adept to a Fortune 500 company. So I think really make sure the complexity matches the challenge, and make sure that you have those parameters in place. Make sure that everyone knows what they're doing, when they're doing it, why they're doing it, how it fits into the overall organization, and what are the steps needed.
Yeah. Now, coming back to your guardrail analogy earlier, this is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian asks, how can an organization determine if their guardrails are strong enough to handle unexpected issues during a project? And I talked about, when you're driving down the highway, you see the skid marks every so often with a car that clearly hit the guardrail, because then the guardrail's all mangled and twisted or whatever. But how do you ensure that the guardrails are strong enough to ensure that, mistakes that humans may make, or inevitable issues that come up during any project, how do you ensure that the guardrails are strong enough to address that stuff?
Well, I think it's, I think it really starts off with before you get the project in place, it's really sitting down and looking at what you're trying to do, and then identifying what the risks are at the beginning of an engagement. We always talk about, in fact, I mentioned that I worked at Deloitte, and it was a very pointed effort on any of our engagements that we never talked about eliminating risk. It was always mitigating risk, because you'll never build a strong enough guardrail that an 18-wheeler can't go over it, or there's always something that could get through that guardrail. But it's really sitting down and identifying at the beginning of the engagement, what are the potential risks and what are the controls that we can put in place. And then I think what is really a great mitigating factor is just that consistent communication, again, at every different level. So making sure that the team's meeting on a weekly basis, making sure everything is going as planned, or you're identifying what some of the challenges or what some of the risks are that you're facing. And we talk about it all the time in our governance structure that we have in place, is an issue that's identified within 5 days, within that 1 week time frame of one status report to the other, is going to be very easily handled compared to an issue that's not identified for a month or a month and a half. So again, address the issues and address the risks and the concerns when they happen, versus letting not having the right process or not having the right tools in place, and letting it go on and letting it become a bigger issue or risk.
Yeah. And speaking of that, this kind of comes back to a point you made earlier about communication, and how communication is one of those key elements of project governance. This question is a comment from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, in my experience, establishing a feedback loop of what's working well and what's not from the teams on the ground being impacted by the transformation usually is lacking. And so it sort of crosses over into the whole realm of change management and communications. But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, how do change management and just overall communications, bi-directional communications, how does that factor in, or how should that be baked into what a project governance framework looks like?
I think again, when we talk about communication and documentation, we talk about, and I think we're going to address this later, but we talk about where we look at overall successes and challenges on the project, and how that can not only be used down the road on an engagement, but can also be bubbled up and used throughout the organization. So what we really try and do on all of our engagements, and again, this is a little bit of one of those, you don't know what you don't know. So organizations that don't know this or that don't do this probably don't know exactly what they're missing out on. But what we try and do is we try and talk about, here's the issues that have been solved. And then here's the decisions that have been made, and how did those decisions affect what's going on? So we look at, did this help the engagement? Can we put these decisions in place further on down the road in the engagement to help it go smoother? And then not only that, how does this relate to the entire organization? Is this something that we could put in place for the entire organization that's going to make everyone better? So I think really, just again, back to my point that I'll make 100 times over, communication and documentation and tracking this, and really letting everyone know that, like, we tend to focus so much on the challenges, again, addressing the challenges, but really letting everyone know, here's something that we found that really has made a big difference from a success level, and bubbling it up throughout the organization.
Yeah. Makes total sense. And it's, it's, to Alcinda's point, and your point too, Nate, it's easy to forget communications when you get heads down and you get buried in all the details of these projects. And you sort of, I don't want to say you stick your head in the ground, but you're just so intensely focused on what's right in front of you. It's easy to forget what's going on around you. There's still a business being run. There's still people being impacted by this. And how do you ensure that that communication is happening, and that we're picking up on risks, and we're picking up on potential warning signs? How does risk management factor into this? By the way, speaking of risk, I just thought of this. How do you ensure that the risk mitigation controls are in place, or that we can proactively identify risks as they start to emerge, rather than waiting until they become such big problems that you can't ignore them anymore?
Well, I think that is a really critical point with risk management. Is, again, I think that we're at the beginning of an engagement. It's fairly easy to sit down and say, here's the big risk that we're going to face. You either going to know that from what you faced before on technology engagements, or that an organization, for example, like an organization might be really bad at documenting their decisions. So they know that that's a risk that they've had as an organization throughout. So those are really easy at the beginning of an engagement to identify. But it's really, I think the key is, as a risk, it's a little bit easy to overreact and just think everything is a risk and we've got to address it. But I always would say err on the side of identifying and addressing and eliminating risk as soon as they become apparent. So don't just assume, hey, this is a risk. I don't think it's going to be an issue. Let's give it a couple weeks and see what happens. Address it. If it really isn't a concern, document that you addressed it and move on. But again, if you address it now and before it becomes a bigger risk or a bigger issue, you're going to be able to way more effectively mitigate that risk, not only at the time, but in the future within the engagement.
Yeah. Makes sense. I'm here with Nate talking about project governance and controls and digital transformations. I've got a lot more to cover with Nate. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 206. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and produced by Major Tom Productions. So thank you for being here today. I'm here with Nate Stroeher. We're talking about project governance and controls and digital transformations and what you can do to ensure you've got the right governance and controls in place as you get ready for and execute your digital strategies. What about, one thing that I can't help but think about when we think about project governance or program governance controls, it's not really sexy stuff to talk about. It's not cool to talk about putting controls in place and, how do you provide oversight and controls? It sounds very draconian or top down command and control sort of thing. Very necessary, but I guess the question becomes, in this world of agile and flexibility and being nimble and all that stuff, how do you find that right balance between having governance controls and structure and that sort of thing versus being agile and flexible and sort of rolling with the punches and adapting as things change throughout the project? How do you find that right balance between the two?
Well, and this will make me sound like the ultimate nerd in saying this, but I think the more controls and the more structure you have in place, the more it allows you to be agile, the more it allows you to be creative. I am, along the third stage theme, I'm fascinated with people that are great with the guitar, and I think about like the fact that there's a structure in place as you play the guitar, and the more you learn that structure, the more you don't worry about it anymore, the more you can be creative. And so I think really where we see organizations thrive is when you have a really good governance structure in place, not only on these engagements, but throughout the organization. If you have that in place, it allows people to, it allows your resources and your mind space to be free to be really worrying about how is the technology going to make the organization better. So I'd say it allows you to be free of worrying about what's going on and more worrying about what you're going to be able to do in the future and how it's going to help the organization in the future.
Yeah, it's another great analogy. Play guitar or any instrument. There's structure. There's patterns. Music is all about patterns and a certain amount of repeatability, but obviously there's a huge amount of creativity. So you've got to be able to have the technically sound piece of it to go with the creative side of it. And I think that's a big part of it too. Is I think if you do it right, your program governance can adapt. Obviously, it should be able to adapt to things as they change. If you've got a clear understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish as an organization, and you've got a clear vision and direction, the governance should reflect that. And it's going to look different for you, for you as an organization than it might with one of your peers based on what it is you're trying to accomplish. Sort of like back to your music analogy, if you're playing rock and roll versus jazz, you're going to have different sorts of governance or patterns or whatever you look for in those sorts of projects. So I think that's a great point. I've never heard anyone say that project governance can actually give you more flexibility. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Now, how can organizations, especially, let me back up for a second. We work with a lot of organizations that are larger multinationals, and they have separate sort of PMO departments or, program management office, program managers and things like that. And anytime there's a big project, they put someone from the PMO on the project to sort of provide that governance and control. But how do you ensure that you're not overcomplicating the governance process? In other words, how do we make sure that it's not so top down and bureaucratic and stifling, that slows down the project? What would you say to that?
I think the best guidance that we have is start out simple. And again, we walk into organizations that are Fortune 500, Fortune 50 organizations. We know that we're not going to be able to manage the project on spreadsheets, but we come into a lot of organizations that are 50, 60 people. We know that probably most of what we can accomplish, we can get by with a simple spreadsheet tool that we can use throughout the engagement. So I would say the best is to sit down and start simple. Start with something that everyone understands, everyone can use. And at the time you find yourself spending more time tracking things manually and spending more time updating your tools than you are using your tools, then it's time to add some complexity. But I think a lot of times organizations tend to get something really complex and they struggle with it and they never really know how to use it completely. So it just becomes more of a headache than it is a tool that can help them. So again, start simple, track the basic things that we've talked about, track decisions, track status, track the issues that you're facing, put together a simple timeline. Some project plans can be as simple as putting together an Excel spreadsheet. Microsoft Project's always a good starting point, but then there's also organizations that are going to need to have something a lot more complex. But you can always add complexity, but taking complexity away is really a lot harder, and it's really going to muddle the process if you get too complex and too robust of a tool at the beginning.
Yeah, good point. And I will say, I don't know if you agree with this or not. I will say that if there's a more commonly likely error, it's that companies err on the side of not enough governance. I mean, it's not that often that we see companies that are just so robust with their program governance or their project governance or their PMO function. They're so robust that they're overcomplicating. I mean, it does happen occasionally, but more often than not, I think the clients we see at third stage are more likely to not have enough controls in place. Would you agree with that, or have you seen otherwise?
No, and I think you're right. And I think I always talk about when people say, "Oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to over communicate with our employees," and it's like, well, error on the side. Go to the point where you really are over communicating. Everyone has 2 minutes in their day to read an email or to listen to a voicemail or watch a video or whatever. 2 minutes isn't going to throw your organization over the edge as far as making everyone so busy. And so, yeah, you're right. We rarely go into an organization that over governs things, but I think, again, kind of keep going until it becomes an issue. But we rarely see that happen. So you can always add more. And again, I think the more the guardrails and the more the controls are in place, the more you're going to free up time and free up headspace for everyone to really focus on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. One dynamic we see with our clients too, fairly commonly as it relates to software vendors and system integrators, the more technically focused people on the project is they tend to be the ones that say, hey, let's not worry about this program governance stuff, because back to your guitar analogy, we just want to play music. We don't need to deal with all this structure and these controls and stuff like that. Let us just go build and design and build the technology. let's get out there and test it. And let's not worry about all these controls. So I think, most organizations we work with feel pressure from their software vendor and their technical implementer, the system integrator, to have less controls in place. Because if you think about it, that allows them to just go deploy technology, and so much of program governance or effective program governance is not just focused on making sure the technology works. That's actually the easy part of these projects. It's more making sure that you've got alignment internally and that your processes fit with the technology and the other way around, to make sure that people are adapting to the change well along the way, all that stuff. And if you don't have the right governance and controls in place, that's the stuff that suffers. It's usually not the software design and build that struggles, although it could struggle too as a result of that. But what do you see as some of the signs of poor program governance? So, in other words, rather than, obviously, if a project completely fails miserably, you could probably look back and say, okay, you didn't have the right governance and controls in place. But what are some of the signs along the way as you're going through an implementation or a project like this? What are some of the warning signs you would look for that says, hey, you probably don't have the right guardrails in place on this project?
Well, I think you could, and I'll probably narrow it down to 4 or 5, but I think really one of the biggest indications is people are spending a lot of time trying to figure out what decisions have been made and why they are where they are. If you have a really well documented communication channel and a good tracking channel for what are our issues, how did we resolve those issues, what are the decisions that have been made, and what are the upcoming tasks as a result of those, then you're going to spend a lot less time trying to recount the past. So I think when we walk into organizations and we can ask them, like, where are your issue trackers? Where are the decisions? Have the decisions been made? If they're really quickly able to answer that question and show us that, then we know that that's probably not the issue. I think the second is communication, and that is really knowing, at a very, very simple level, where are we going, and what are the upcoming potential challenges that we are going to face. That being said, also within that communication, we have to have a really clear understanding of who's doing what. So when we walk into organizations, probably every one of the engagements that we come in that's had some sort of failure or some sort of timeline or budget issue, it's because decisions are being made by the people that shouldn't be making those decisions. So IT is making decisions for the finance department, or finance is making decisions for the entire organization, and not really incorporating and not truly incorporating who is responsible to make those decisions and who needs to be making them. So it's kind of summed up in making sure the right people are making the right decisions and are doing the right things within the project, and making sure that's really clear throughout the organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, because so much of project governance isn't just the tools, like the issue tracker and the risk logs and things, some of the things that you've alluded to. It's not just that. It's also ensuring that there's clarity around how we make decisions. And it's a great point. And I had a professor on this podcast before. He's a professor out of it's either Amsterdam or Brussels. I think he's based out of Amsterdam. His university's in Brussels, but I think he lives in Amsterdam. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's in Europe. His name's Hans Mulder, and he's been on this podcast before. And he talks about how he's done a ton of research of, like, I think it's over 100,000 ERP implementations. And he studied these 100,000 implementations and looked at the data. And he found that the number one cause of delays and budget overruns is what he calls decision latency. And it's, in other words, it's how fast can an organization make a decision. And so often we get into these projects where no one really knows how to make the decision. For example, you've got this software that has off-the-shelf functionality, pre-configured functionality, whatever, and it doesn't match perfectly with the way you want it to work. Surprise, surprise. That happens a lot. Like in any project, that's going to happen. So then the question is, well, what do we do? Do we change our processes to fit the software? Do we customize the software to fit the processes? Do we go find a third-party bolt-on to address that gap in the software functionality? And suddenly, these teams they start spinning in circles trying to make decisions. and they don't know like what's the right answer. And so much of that depends on what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. What are the goals, and what are the, the strategic imperatives of what it is, that this project is supposed to accomplish for the organization. And if you don't have that clarity, I feel like that clarity strategically is really the foundation for project governance, because your project governance has to reflect the strategy, the goals, the overall direction. Those are the guardrails, right? The guardrails you're talking about earlier is that this is the direction we're going as an organization, and here's how we make decisions, and we've got a business case to support it and all that stuff. Is that what you've seen, or how do you factor in that strategic alignment with project governance?
No, I think that's great. And in fact, as you were saying that, I was thinking about what we try to put into our status reports. And this was a result of a client that we had when I first joined Third Stage, really kind of elaborated on that whole decision documentation. And this organization was really clear as far as what decision did we make? We set the software up to do X, Y, and Z. Why did we make that decision? And what are potential changes in the future that might make us change that decision? And I think when you really look at those three elements and you break it down that simplistically, or make it that simplistic, then it really allows you in the future to come back and say, oh, you know what? Right now we set the software up to do this and this, and it's really not helping us. Let's go back and figure out why we set it up that way. And then you find out, oh, we did it because we were taking all of our orders online, and now we're taking them by phone and online. So that decision needs to change, and we're going to document this decision going forward. So I think it's, you could get way in the weeds and try to overanalyze a decision, and you're just going to have paralysis by analysis. Or you can sit down and say, here's the decision. Here's why we made it. Here's what could change in the future, and let's move on. And then if you have that clearly documented, it's a lot easier to come back and address it when you run into a new issue going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also puts it takes some of the pressure off the project team, the project sponsor, and it puts it back on the executives. Because really, the executives aren't responsible for executing the project and mitigating all the risks and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, they've got to delegate a lot of that to the project team, but the executive team has to have that clarity and that ability to articulate how this project fits into the overall strategy. And by the way, how are decisions going to be made, and what are the expectations around how decisions are made? What goals are we trying to accomplish as we make some of these various trade-offs and tough decisions that are never perfect? You've got to make these trade-offs or these decisions that oftentimes are the lesser of two evils. But if you have clarity around how to make those decisions and what goals you're trying to accomplish starting at the top of the organization, that makes things a lot more clear. But what ends up happening is so many organizations just think, well, this is just an ERP upgrade, so we're just going to let the project team have at it and go upgrade the technology. How hard can it be? But obviously, there's a lot of details that go into that. In fact, I'm going to put up another QR code right here, and this is our phase 0 checklist. And this stuff we're talking about here is really stuff that you should put in place before you start the implementation. Now, it's better late than never, but if you're early in a digital transformation or an ERP project, now is the time to put this stuff in place. And this phase 0 checklist covers way beyond what we're talking about here today. It's not just project governance and controls. It's also talking about business process definition and change strategies and stuff that you should make sure you have in place before you really start getting into the meat of the implementation. So scan this QR code right here. I'll drop it in the link for this podcast episode as well in the show notes. But if you want to check out that list, you can get that off our website there. But while I leave that up there, I want to come back to another question here that was a really good one, sort of related to what we were just talking about, Nate, around making these decisions and these trade-offs. But this is from Xenon. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Xenon on LinkedIn says, in your program governance system, how do you align requirements with clients as well as disparate sales and delivery teams? Which I think is a good question, because you get these technology providers that come in and sell you a vision or sell you the technology, but how do you ensure that the client requirements, what the technology can do, what the sales people have said they could do, and the delivery teams, how do you ensure, in program governance that all this stuff is addressed and aligned?
Yeah, and I think it really starts off, and this overlaps a little bit with change management, but I think it really starts off of what I alluded to earlier is that before the project even kicks off, it's sitting down and saying, where are we now? Where do we want to be? And how will this technology or this initiative get us to where we want to be? And so to sit down and say, okay, we're this organization, we want to be a $500 million organization in the future. This technology is going to allow us to expand our sales, and then really going through and making sure that what we need the technology to do is what's been promised from the vendor or whatever the source may be, and really making sure that they can actually do what we need it to do and that it can do what they've promised. So those are, and I break those down because first of all, can it do what they told us it can do? A lot of times that answer might be less than 100, it might be 90%. And then not only that, but if it does what they tell us it can do, is it going to help us get to where we want to be? Or are we going to put a system in place and we're still going to be manually tracking orders because the system never was able to track the orders how we wanted it, or whatever that might be? So where we are, where we want to be, what the technology can do, and if it can do what it says it can do, is that what we need to get to where we need to be in the future?
Yeah. Yeah. Here's an interesting comment from Ed on YouTube. Ed says, maybe the concern is the fear of the business taking a decision that cannot be understood and the implications to the project cost or timing impact. This feedback is a job from the vendor or consultant. And I want to talk about this just for a second, or get your take on this, Nate, because this is a really interesting point and actually there's another follow-up question from another audience member on LinkedIn I want to get to here in just a second. In fact, let me pull this up too, and I'll sort of sum it all up into a more concise question here, but I think these are really related, good questions. So that's Ed's question. Maybe the fear of the business making a decision that you can't understand the implications on the project cost or the timing, and you need your outside vendor or consultant to help you understand that. That's part one. Part two comes from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, if we're saying that clients don't know what we don't know, who defines when a project is complete? And is that done up front or at the end of a project? Basically, how do we ensure that we don't have moving targets? Now, I want to kind of roll this all into one theme, which is a client, even if a client has a real robust PMO function, a program management office function within the organization. Most organizations don't, but even if they do, they're not experts in ERP implementations. They probably haven't done a lot of these projects because most organizations only do this once every 10 or 20 or 30 years. So they're not going to be experts in-house to do this. So they do rely on their outside consultants or their vendors. However, oftentimes, more often than not, vendors are focused on, is the technology working? Does it work? Are the bugs worked out? Do the workflows work? That's fine. We need to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization is ready and that the organization has adapted the technology and that the processes and the technologies are all aligned and roles and responsibilities are all well-defined. You could have perfectly designed and deployed technology, but still have a complete disaster, complete failure in the implementation, not because the vendor didn't do their job, but because there's all the other non-technical stuff that didn't happen. So what do you do when you've got a software vendor whispering in your ear that, hey, everything's fine, the technology works, let's just hit the button and go live? We're not experts in ERP implementations because we're not, we have a business to run day to day. How do you reconcile that? Like, what are some of the ways that we, for example, third stage can, have provided that stopgap, or what are some of the ways that organizations can overcome that?
Well, and we've run into this quite a few times, and I think really a big chunk of mitigating this risk or mitigating getting into that position in the first place is taking a step back and saying, where is this overall project fit into the organization? When we go back to that executive visioning, where are we going to be, and how's this technology going to help? But it's really rare if almost I don't think we ever see it, that organizations are going through a lot more than just this technology implementation. We have one client that I think is probably implementing alongside of what we're working on. They're implementing 10 to 15 more technology solutions within the organization. There's going to be change management. There's going to be organizational changes throughout the engagement. So it's really stepping back before you come to that point where you hit the button and go live and say, okay, now we've promised what we delivered. everything's going to be fine, we're good. And it's really stepping back and saying, where does this fit into the overall picture? And if we get to that milestone, is this in alignment with the rest of the organization? So are we, not only are we supporting what the organization wants to do, but are we looking at ourselves in relation to all the other initiatives that are going on within the organization, and is it all moving towards the right direction? And that's not I think, Eric, you could probably elaborate on this, but that's a really tough one, because everyone's working in their bubble, and at the executive level, there's probably a pretty clear understanding of where everything fits together. But beyond that, everyone kind of has their day-to-day job, and they have their responsibilities. And when you add that to a technology implementation, it becomes even more siloed. So it's really taking that step back and saying, how are we going to interact with all the other engagements, and how does this support the overall vision as part of the overall organization?
Right. Yeah. And how do you make sure that you're kind of coming back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago? We were talking about the whole concept of decision making, and making sure you've got internal alignment. How do you ensure that all stakeholders are aligned on the governance protocols and the project methodologies from the outset? How do you define these, especially if you're an organization that's not used to these big, large, complex projects, you don't have your own internal PMO department or function. How do you get that alignment to make sure you've got the right governance in place for your transformation?
Well, I think it really starts with the executive sponsorship, and it's really sitting down and making sure that everyone knows that this is part of an overall organizational initiative. So if you have poor executive sponsorship at the beginning, I think when we talk about what we see from a third stage point of view, that's usually where projects have the best chance of going off the rail. If there's not that overall buy-in from the executive team, and there's not a clear understanding of just exactly what this means to the organization, and that it's a key part of the organization, and what everyone's role is within the initiative, and how that plays within the organization. If you don't have that clear understanding and that clear sponsorship and ownership by the executive team, you're really setting yourself up for a lot of challenges in the future.
Right. Looks like we've got a guest appearance here, a second guest on the show here today. Does she have something?
Snow day for Denver Public Schools.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That's is it completely closed today, or is it a late start?
2-hour late start. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Just enough to be on the podcast.
Yeah. It's freezing cold in Colorado right now, so a lot of schools have late starts here today, but thankfully it's going to warm up here today. So what about, so companies that are about to start their new digital transformation, they're early on, or they're in the early stages of planning for a project. Maybe they've already gotten started on the project. What advice would you give to companies that are just starting to figure out, or trying to figure out, how to get the right governance and control frameworks in place? What sort of starting advice could you leave us with here today?
I would say start simple, and what we try and do is really hit those elements of putting the right tools in place, and making sure everyone knows what the tools are, how to use the tools, and why we're using the tools. So sitting down and meeting with the different groups, and coming up to an agreement, or coming up with an agreement on what the communication plan is going to be. Are we going to have live communication? Is it going to be a conference call? Is it going to be a video? How often that occurs, and exactly what the structure of that communication is going to look like. And then really sitting down and just putting the tools in place, putting down the status report tools, putting down a project plan that everyone knows exactly how to use and what it means to them, and putting in a tool and a methodology to track your issues and your decisions. And again, start simple. Don't let the complexity of all these different tools slow you down. Really sit down, and if it has to start with an Excel spreadsheet, or if it has to be done manually, just get it in place and build on it as you go forward. But getting that framework in place is critical at the beginning, because that is going to give everyone, again, the guardrails and the lane markers going forward, so everyone knows exactly what their role is in the project, and putting the controls in place and the communication in place so everyone knows where we're going and how we're going to get there.
Yeah, great advice. And another, piece of advice I'll leave you with, in addition to what Nate just said, is download this Phase Zero checklist right here. It'll get you started on some of the things you should think about as you're planning for your implementation, including project governance and controls, but also covers things around change management and understanding your business processes, your data, your current system landscape, all that stuff. So check this out right here, Phase Zero checklist. You can get it off our website. Just scan that QR code and we'll drop it in the chat as well, or in the show notes as well. All right, great conversation, Nate. Enjoyed that topic. It's something we've never covered on this episode or on this podcast before, so I appreciate you being here and appreciate the audience questions as well. We're going to debrief on a couple of the points that we just talked about with Nate, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to the Transformation Ground Control podcast, number 206. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, produced by Major Tom Productions. So, Darian, we just had Nate on the show. First time we've talked about project governance and controls in that level of detail on this podcast, but what were your thoughts and takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, I think he did a really good job simplifying a lot of things and creating a lot of analogies that were really easy to understand, but also great analogies for governance as well. I particularly like the one in the beginning there, the guardrails and everything like that coming in on the road, because like he said, something can always go through the guardrails, like, right? It could be an 18-wheeler, something could always go wrong on a project. But with that, you can put specific guardrails in to try and avoid that, of course, at all costs. Some other things I found interesting was just, how how he suggested that even starting a rough skeleton plan early, like testing data migration, and in the first couple of weeks with that provides so much clarity and covers potential challenges that you could really have throughout your digital transformation. So I thought that was some good advice as well. But as a follow-up question to that, Eric, how do you balance the need to test early without overwhelming the team or just jeopardizing the timeline?
Well, I think first and foremost is you want to build that buffer or that work stream into your overall project plan. So if you know that you've got to test early and you want to test early, you bake that into the project plan. The problem is when organizations later on realize in the middle of the project that they want to test earlier, that they need to test more, but they haven't built that into the plan. So it gets back to something we've talked about in this show, and I talk about it a lot on my YouTube channel too, where one of the root causes of failure, one of the top 2 or 3 reasons why projects fail in terms of the root causes of why they fail is because companies have unrealistic expectations of what it takes to be successful and what they need to do to be successful in their digital transformations. It's not even necessarily that they don't understand all the different things that need to happen. They just don't understand the time it takes and little things like making decisions. How long will it take us to make decisions around what our process should look like, or how we might change our process to fit the new software, or vice versa. Those decisions take time, but in most project plans that vendors give you, they don't really account for that. It sort of assumes that you're just going to give them the answer right away and they're going to keep moving through the project. But the minute you say, hey, it's going to take us a few days to figure this out, typically that's a few days that you're pushing the project out. And by the way, the team, the hourly resources that you have on the project from the software vendor are still billing by the hour while they wait for you to make these decisions in most cases, or they go find something else to start on while they're waiting for you to come back with an answer. So that's some of the things you've got to think about when you're looking at it. But one thing I was going to mention too is I didn't think about it when Nate was on. I thought of it after we finished up. But when he was talking about the guardrails, and in the comment you were just talking about it's always possible that you can plow through a guardrail if you've got an 18-wheeler or whatever. I agree with that for the most part, but at the same time, when you're continuing with the highway analogy, when you're going through a highway and you're coming around a sharp corner, for example, usually you notice that it's not the same guardrail going around the sharp corner. Usually there's some additional reinforcement there because people that designed it know that, okay, if there's going to be someone that slides off the road, it's more likely to be here than it is back on the straight and narrow. And so I think that's a way you could look at project governance and controls too, is for example, that change resistance is going to be an issue. So what are we going to do to reinforce that and add some additional controls just in that area? Because we know that's going to be a higher risk area, maybe more so than the technology configuration or the technology testing or whatever. So that's the sort of thing you can think about, is where are those highest risk areas and how can we add additional reinforcement in those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And one more question. Do you have any more good analogies for governance?
Not as good as that one. I thought that was really good. I mean, I've heard the guardrail one, and I use the guardrail one all the time, but I never took it a step further, which is totally common sense, but sometimes I lack common sense. So that it would make sense that I wouldn't pick up on this, but the dotted lines and the signs and the communication, all that stuff. I think that's probably the best analogy I can think of.
Yeah, I also really liked when you guys were referencing to musicians and how they have to read their music and everything like that. The guitar, that was a good analogy as well. So we had some different really good analogies. So I was just seeing if you could come up with any other ones.
No, I mean, I'm not going to top those two for sure. Not anytime soon. Maybe if I spend a lot of time thinking about it, I'll think of something that's comparable.
Yeah, we'll have to have them on again and see if we can come up with any more.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that was a great interview with Nate today. I think we learned a lot from him, and I'm excited to get into this next topic.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about whether or not ERP consultants are worth the money, and taking it a step further, also how to determine whether or not you've found the right ERP consultants, or what are some of the criteria you should be looking for to make sure that you get the right consultants that deliver the most value for your project. So this is a YouTube clip, or a clip from my YouTube channel that I published recently, where I dive into a few different things to think about. So let's roll that clip and we'll come back and chat about it as well. One of the first criteria to evaluate with your ERP consultants is independence. In other words, you want someone that's a tech agnostic provider that isn't going to be influenced by software vendors and isn't going to have an economic incentive to sell you more software than you really need. Now, when I first started my career, this is one of the areas that I got super jaded about in my early jobs. And the reason for that is because I found that we were making recommendations that didn't make sense for our clients, but they made more sense for us as a consulting firm because we were making money to make certain recommendations. And this is certainly important during the ERP evaluation process. When you're evaluating potential software vendors, it's extremely important, but it's just as important during implementation as well, because you want to make sure you have a consulting provider that, again, isn't focused on getting your SaaS and cloud subscriptions up and running and billing as fast as possible. You want to make sure your business is actually being transformed and you're being aggressive in your timeline, but you're not being so aggressive that it disrupts your business simply because it might help the software vendor. So those are the things you want to consider, is how do I find that right partner that's going to be independent and tech agnostic, and it's going to represent our interests, not that of the software vendor or any other technology provider. Now, independence is just one component that you want to consider. There's several others that I'm going to get to throughout this video as well. One of the best ways to get a feel for whether or not a consulting firm is the right fit for your organization is to look at the thought leadership that consulting firm is publishing. You can look to YouTube videos like our YouTube channel, my individual YouTube channel. You can look to blogs, you can look to LinkedIn posts, social media posts, and just try to get a feel for how the consulting firm thinks about digital transformations and ERP projects in particular. Now, if you don't see any thought leadership, that might be a red flag. That might be something that you question and wonder, does this consulting firm truly have the internal competencies if they're not willing to share it and publicize that knowledge and that experience? So really understanding the thought leadership, evaluating what content those consulting providers distribute to the marketplace can give you a good flavor of not only if they know what they're talking about, but if their philosophy as a consulting firm matches what you're looking for in your ERP implementation. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of one and two man and woman shops out there that proclaim to be independent ERP consultants. There's a lot of really small mom and pop shops that can help you select software. Maybe they can help provide you some implementation support as well. But at the end of the day, you need a company that can scale. You need a company that has enough breadth, both industry-wise and geographically, to help make sure they can satisfy the needs of your organization. While it's important to make sure that your consulting partner has experience in your specific industry, it's also helpful to recognize what experience they have outside your industry. And this is an underrated evaluation criteria, in my opinion, because that breadth of experience actually makes you better in any one given industry. There's a lot of cross-pollination and best practices you can learn from other industries in addition to understanding your specific industry. So you want to have a consulting firm that has at least several hundred clients that they've worked with and they can point to across multiple industries that are good case studies of how to make these projects successful. In addition, you want to look at geographic reach, especially if you're a multinational corporation or organization. You want to make sure you have a consulting team that can support you, not just in your home country, but also through the other locations, physically visiting those locations to be on site and boots on the ground, helping support your global initiative and your global ERP project. So look to industry reach and geographic reach as two important criteria you want to evaluate for any consulting firm you might consider. You also want to look at the methodologies and tools that the consulting firm provides. You want to look at what frameworks do they use to help you through the selection and the planning and the implementation process. You want to look at what technology tools they use to help enable and automate some of the consulting activities that happen during a project. For example, if there's manual processes that are taking a lot of time, that's going to cost you in terms of high bill rates that consultants charge you. But if they have technology and tools that make their jobs more efficient and allow them to be better because they allow them to tap into collective knowledge beyond their own individual knowledge, that's just going to give you a lot more power and a lot more scale within the consulting team that you leverage for your project. So look at the methodologies and tools, make sure you understand the approach and the tool sets they're going to use, and make sure it's a good fit for what it is you're looking for and what you think is going to make your project successful. As important as methodologies and tools are and other qualifications, at the end of the day, you just have to feel good about the consulting firm you're hiring. You have to like the people you're working with, not just the leadership of the company, but also, more importantly, the boots on the ground project team that you'd be working with on your project. Are these people that are going to resonate well with your organization? Are these consultants that are going to come in with all the answers and they're going to have a condescending attitude towards your people? If so, that may not be a good cultural fit for you. But if these are people that you could see yourselves working with side by side for the next however many months or years during your ERP project, that's probably a good indicator that it might be a good fit, assuming that these same people that you like so well on a personal level, assuming they have some of the other qualifications we talked about throughout this video as well. So that was the clip from YouTube where I talk about how to determine whether or not ERP consultants are worth the money and whether or not you found the right ERP consultants in the first place. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that, Darian?
Yeah, and I think first, my number one takeaway is just the emphasis on independence. I know that's something that obviously Third Stage really values and you really value personally, but having that independence or an independent ERP consultant or any consultant that's independent from softwares is definitely a advantage for companies that are hiring consultants, because you get to see a lot of different perspectives and they can point out things that maybe if a software was maybe paying them, they wouldn't otherwise. But with this, Eric, I want to do some follow-up questions on independence specifically. What are some red flags that indicate a consultant might have conflicts of interest?
Well, I think unfortunately you have to go in with the assumption that the consultant is more likely than not going to have a conflict of interest, only because that's how the industry worked and has always worked. Now, I will say in recent years, in the last 5 years in particular, maybe 10 years, there's been a proliferation of independent consulting firms over time. Certainly a lot more now than when Third Stage first started. So there are more independent consultants out there. So now the other risk that you have to consider is not only is the consulting firm you're working with, are they truly unbiased in terms of economic incentive? So in other words, if they are getting any sort of financial kickback from the software vendor, that means they're going to be biased and they're not acting in your best interest. We've had a couple clients, probably two over the years. I'm surprised it's only two. So I'll share this little secret that I've learned from clients that have asked us to do this. But there's been a couple clients that have asked us to incorporate into their contracts pretty stiff penalties and cancellation clauses if there's any or if it's determined that we are somehow affiliated with a software vendor financially. And we're happy to do it because we're not. So we know we're not going to run into trouble with that. But if a consultant refuses to put their money where their mouth is, or to put that in writing in a contract, that should be a red flag. So that's one layer is, are they truly economically unbiased? But the second thing that's actually harder to pick up on, but it's just as concerning, is when an ERP consultant doesn't know, they've got blind spots, especially some of these 1 and 2 and 5 man or woman shops. They're really small consulting firms that maybe they are truly independent in terms of they don't have an affiliation with software vendors, but they're not big enough and they don't have the tool sets and the experience to really know all the different systems out there. And so they go with sort of what they know best. If it's someone that grew up in the Microsoft space, for example, that's all they really know. Even if they're not getting paid by Microsoft, they might just lead with a Microsoft first mentality because that's what they know best. And it's just path of least resistance for them. So the way around that is, a lot of times clients will ask us, tell us the last 20 or 50 or however many software selections you've done. And can you share with us the short list of which short list you recommended, and then ultimately which product you recommended and implemented for that client? And when you look at our list, it's completely random. I mean, it's just a bizarre, it looks like, throwing darts almost, but obviously there's a logic to why we recommended what we did to different clients, but every client has different needs, and you'll certainly see some repeats. I mean, you'll see, for example, SAP's on there a couple times, or Oracle, Microsoft, only because they are such big, well-known systems, but they're certainly not dominating the list of recommendations we make. So that's another thing you could do, is ask the consulting firm to recommend the last, or to give you a list of the last 20 or 50 or however many projects they did in a software selection, and tell us what the short list was and what the recommendation was. So that's another way to look around it. You just want to make sure that there's not like an unintentional bias that's not just financial, but more of a lack of knowledge.
Yeah, that's some really great advice for companies that are looking for an independent consulting firm specifically. To get a little bit more advice out of you, how can companies evaluate whether a consulting firm's tools align with their project's unique needs?
Well, I think any tool set you can start with is a good starting point. So I think you have to assume that this is a good starting point, but I'm probably going to have to tailor this to fit my needs. And so I don't know that's a question of, is it a good fit? It's how can I make this, how can I take this great starting point that has maybe worked in the past for these consultants, how can I take that and tweak it to fit who I am as a company? And also, poke holes in it or challenge it. I mean, I was just in a meeting last week for a client in the Eastern United States. It's a big manufacturing company. And they were asking us that. I mean, they were asking, we were going through our proposal with them because they're just starting out. We're just getting started with this company. And they were questioning the timeline and saying, hey, we move really slow as a company. Do you think this timeline is realistic, or do we need to add time to it? And so you sort of dig into it, and you start asking more questions around it, and we refined it and stretched out the timeline, not only because they asked or because they said it might need to take longer, but as we dug deeper into why they thought that, we agreed with them. Like, yeah, this probably will take longer. So you just want to have a conversation like that. And you have to work. I think you need a consulting firm that has a good starting point, but is flexible enough to where they know where to pivot and they know where to modify. Just because this worked for the last client doesn't mean this exact same cookie cutter thing is going to work for you. You can use 80% of it or whatever, but you're probably going to have to modify some things to make it fit you. And I think that's the assumption you've got to go in with.
Yeah, absolutely. Some more great advice. Hopefully that was helpful for any companies looking for some independent consultants on how to either handle conversations during proposals or, really ensure that a consulting company is truly independent.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, hopefully that helps. And especially for those of you that are trying to find the best ERP consultant for your organization. If you certainly, if you'd like to learn more about Third Stage and how we might be able to help you, you can reach out to me, and my contact information is included in the show notes in the description field below. So be sure to reach out if you want to chat about Third Stage and how we might be able to help you through either your selection or your implementation planning phase 0 and or your actual implementation itself, helping you with the program management. We can help you with all that stuff. So be sure to reach out if you're interested in chatting more about that. But thank you to Nate for being here today. Thank you, Darian, for another great episode, and thank you to the audience for all the great questions and comments you've provided here today. Again, you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. If you want to go see past episodes or listen to or watch past episodes of the show, go to that same website, transformationgroundcontrol.com. Be sure to check out Third Stage Consulting's website at thirdstage-consulting.com. Again, my name is Eric Kimberling. We'll be back next week with another episode of Transformation Ground Control. Hope you have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you soon. Take care.